One was a poet with a flair for dramatic size. The other, a spice merchant's daughter who could price nutmeg in her sleep. Their love, a masterpiece of missed caravans, misplaced scrolls, and romantic timing so bad it became legendary. This isn't a tale of passion. It's a tale of patience, of letters that took years to arrive, of camels that refused to cooperate, of moonlit nights filled with longing, lukewarm yak milk, and the occasional philosophical goat. So, if you're ready to drift into dreams, let this story wrap around you like a dusty silk blanket. It's long, it's winding, it's just boring enough to lull you into blissful unconsciousness, because nothing says bedtime like a romance that never quite got there. And hey, before you snore off into the dunes, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which dessert you're watching from. Are you curled up in Kashgar, dozing off in Damascus, or just stuck behind a camel in cave? I need to know. For historical purposes, it was the year of the slightly bent wheel, somewhere around 732 CE, when Bahram the scribe joined a merchant caravan bound for Dunhuang. His job? To record every camel sneeze, sandal malfunction, and spice inventory adjustment with excruciating detail. His passion? A woman he'd never met. Her name was Lianhua, and Bahram had seen it once, on a trade manifest stuck to a crate of underwhelming cinnamon. That was enough. He was in love. Bahram began writing her letters. Long, slow letters. Letters that began with, "Dearest Lianhua, I hope this letter finds you somewhere between mildly content and slightly bored." He sealed them with wax made from the tears of disappointed apricots and entrusted them to Mahmud, his camel, who had a strong dislike for romance and an even stronger dislike for walking in a straight line. The caravan itself was a masterpiece of inefficiency. One camel refused to move unless serenaded with lute music. Another insisted on walking backwards. The spice merchant argued daily with a goat over cumin pricing. Bahram, ever patient, recorded it all in his scrolls, which were later used as sleep aids in 3 different kingdoms. At night, under the moonlit tents, Bahram would sigh dramatically and recite his poetry to the stars. The stars, being stars, offered no feedback. Mahmud would occasionally groan in protest, which Bahram took as constructive criticism. Meanwhile, in Dunhuang, Lianhua was busy not knowing Bahram existed. She spent her days alphabetizing spices and her nights dreaming of a man who could price cardamom without crying. She once received a letter addressed to Lianhua, or possibly someone else, which she mistook for a tax notice and used to wrap dried ginger. And so, the caravan creaked forward, slowly, painfully, with the grace of a sleepy yak on stilts. Bahram continued to write. Lianhua continued to not receive, and the Silk Road, as always, remained a place where love moved at the speed of a camel with commitment issues. In the bustling spice bazaar of Dunhuang, where the air smelled faintly of ambition and aggressively priced turmeric, Lianhua was having a very average day. She had just alphabetized her entire cumin collection, reorganized the coriander by emotional intensity, and was now staring at a crate of cardamom that refused to behave. The cardamom was cursed, not in a dramatic, fire-breathing way, more in a makes people sneeze and forget where they put things kind of way. Lianhua suspected it had absorbed the energy of a very confused monk who once tried to meditate inside the crate. As she adjusted the price tag for the 5th time. It kept changing itself to too much. A scroll arrived. It was dusty, slightly damp, and smelled like camel regret. The courier handed it to her with a shrug and a yawn, then wandered off to argue with a pigeon. The scroll read, "Dearest Lianhua, I hope this letter finds you somewhere between mildly content and slightly bored. I saw your name once on a cinnamon manifest and have loved you ever since. Yours in poetic confusion, Bahram." Lianhua blinked. She had never met a Bahram. She had never been on a cinnamon manifest. She wasn't even sure what poetic confusion looked like. She turned the scroll over. On the back was a doodle of a camel wearing a hat. She showed it to her father, who squinted and said, "This looks like a tax notice. Burn it." Instead, Lianhua tucked it into her spice ledger. Between nutmeg, flirtatious, and paprika, emotionally unavailable. Something about the letter made her curious. Or maybe it was the camel hat. That night, under a sky full of stars and one very judgmental owl, Lianhua dreamed of a man who wrote letters to strangers and sealed them with apricot tears. She didn't know his face. She didn't know his voice. But she knew one thing. He had terrible handwriting. Mahmoud the camel had opinions, strong ones. He disliked poetry, preferred his dates pitted, and once spat on a lute player for humming in a romantic key. Bahram, ever the hopeful scribe, had tried reading his latest love letter aloud to Mahmoud under the stars. Mahmoud responded by sitting down and refusing to get up for 3 hours. The caravan was unimpressed. Spice deliveries were delayed. A shipment of saffron turned existential. One merchant began questioning the meaning of cumin. Bahram apologized profusely, but Mahmoud remained unmoved, both emotionally and physically. Perhaps, Bahram mused aloud, he's protesting the concept of love. The camel blinked slowly, as if to say, love is a logistical nightmare, and you should know better. Still, Bahram persisted. He wrote another letter to Lianhua, this time shorter, more practical. Dear Lianhua, I hope this finds you awake, or asleep. Either is fine. I am currently negotiating with a camel about the nature of affection. Yours in mild despair, Bahram. He tied the scroll to Mahmud's saddle, hoping the camel might deliver it if properly bribed with figs. Mahmud ate the figs, then sat on the scroll. Meanwhile, Lianhua was having a quiet evening in Dunhuang, sipping lukewarm tea and wondering why her cinnamon kept rearranging itself alphabetically. She had begun to suspect the cursed cardamom was influencing nearby spices. She considered writing a letter to someone, anyone, but didn't know who to address it to. She stared at the stars and whispered, I wish someone would send me a scroll that wasn't about taxes. Back in the desert, Bahram tried singing a lullaby to Mahmud. The camel stood up, walked 10 paces, and sat down again. Bahram took this as progress, and so the caravan continued, slowly, stubbornly, and with one camel who believed romance was best left to goats. Bahram's latest love letter was a masterpiece of emotional ambiguity. It began with a metaphor about cinnamon and ended with a drawing of 2 camels sharing a fig. He folded it carefully, sealed it with apricot wax again, and handed it to a passing courier who looked trustworthy enough, despite wearing one sandal and arguing with a pigeon. The courier, whose name may or may not have been Greg, delivered the scroll to the nearest administrative outpost, where it was promptly mistaken for a tax declaration. The clerk, a man named Farouk, who had never known love, but once felt a strong connection to a particularly symmetrical onion, read the scroll aloud. Dearest Lianhua, your name is a spice in my soul. I dream of your cumin-scented laughter. Yours in longing, Bahram. Farouk squinted. Clearly a bribe, he muttered, stamping it with the official seal of mild suspicion and filing it under unclassified emotional transactions. Meanwhile, Bahram waited patiently for a reply. He even composed a second letter, shorter this time, in case Lianhua preferred concise romance. Dear Lianhua, I miss you. Also, I've run out of figs. Yours, Bahram. This one was tied to Mahmud's tail. Mahmud, in protest, sat on a cactus. Back in Dunhuang, Lianhua was reorganizing her spice shelf by emotional resonance. She paused, sensing a romantic disturbance in the desert. She checked her ledger. No new scrolls, just a receipt for 3 kilos of confused cardamom and a note from a monk asking if paprika could be used for enlightenment. She sighed. If only someone would send me a scroll that wasn't about taxes or spiritual seasoning. Farouk, meanwhile, had begun reading Bahram's letter to his colleagues during lunch. It became a local sensation. One clerk cried. Another proposed to a jar of pickles. Bahram's words were finally touching hearts, just not the one he intended. And so, the scroll of misunderstood affection traveled through the bureaucracy of the Silk Road, stamped, misfiled, and occasionally recited at weddings. Bahram remained hopeful. Lianhua remained unaware. Mahmud remained deeply unimpressed. The caravan had finally reached an oasis, not the famous kind with palm trees and dramatic sunsets. No, this one was more of a puddle with ambition. A few shrubs leaned in for gossip, and one very philosophical goat stood guard, chewing thoughtfully on a sandal. Bahram was hopeful. He had heard rumors, whispers carried by spice traders, and one extremely chatty parrot, that Lianhua might be passing through this very oasis. He rehearsed his greeting. Hello, I am Bahram. I write scrolls. I admire your cumin. It needed work. He adjusted his robe, fluffed his scroll pouch, and practiced smiling in a way that didn't look like he had just eaten sour dates. Mahmud, the camel, watched with the expression of someone who had seen this romantic optimism before and knew how it ended, with sighs and sand in uncomfortable places. Meanwhile, Lianhua was indeed nearby. Her caravan had stopped at a different oasis, one with actual water and snacks. She was sipping tea made from mildly judgmental mint leaves and listening to a merchant explain the emotional benefits of fennel. She had heard of Bahram too, a poet, a dreamer, possibly a tax collector. The details were fuzzy. She wondered if he was real, or just a figment of the Silk Road-esque collective imagination, like punctual camels or honest spice pricing. Back at the puddle oasis, Bahram spotted a figure in the distance. He squinted. Was it her? Was it a mirage? Was it just a goat wearing a shawl? He approached. The goat stared back, then said, telepathically, Bahram assumed, she's not here, but I am, and I have thoughts on love. Bahram sat beside the goat and shared his latest poem. The goat chewed thoughtfully, then wandered off to contemplate sandal philosophy. And so, the lovers missed each other again, by a few miles, by a few hours, by one very confused goat. But the stars above twinkled knowingly. The Silk Road was long, the nights were many, and love, like a camel with commitment issues, always found a way to wander back. In the bustling bazaars of not quite Kashgar, a merchant named Rafi had a new hobby, matchmaking. Not professionally, of course. He had no training, no success stories, and no understanding of human emotion. But he did have a clipboard and a camel named Doris, who nodded encouragingly. Rafi had heard whispers of Bahram, the lovesick poet, with a scroll pouch full of sighs. He had also heard of Lianhua, the spice merchant, S daughter, with a ledger so precise it once corrected a monk's spiritual imbalance. Naturally, Rafi assumed they were meant to be. There was just one problem. Rafi thought Bahram was someone named Babar. Babar the scroll guy. He shouted to a passing caravan. He writes poems about onions and dreams of a woman who smells like cinnamon. The caravan nodded politely and moved on. One camel spat in agreement. Meanwhile, Bahram was composing his 17th letter to Lianhua. It began, "Dearest Lianhua, today I saw a cloud shaped like your spice shelf. I wept softly into my lentils. Yours in emotional humidity, Bahram." Rafi intercepted the letter and, convinced it was from Babar, forwarded it to a woman named Lin, who sold fermented radishes and had no interest in poetry unless it rhymed with prophet. Lin read the scroll, blinked twice, and used it to wrap a particularly moody turnip. Back in Dunhuang, Lianhua received a scroll addressed to the woman who smells like cinnamon. She opened it cautiously, expecting either romance or a recipe. It was neither. It was a drawing of two camels, kissing under a fig tree. Signed Babar. She frowned. Who is Babar? And why does he think I smell like cinnamon? She tucked the scroll into her ledger under miscellaneous confusion and went back to pricing nutmeg by emotional weight. Rafi, meanwhile, was thrilled. They're practically married, he declared, handing out celebratory raisins to confused passers-by. Bahram remained unaware. Lianhua remained unconvinced. And the Silk Road, as always, remained a place where love was frequently misfiled and occasionally fermented. The caravanserai was bustling, not with excitement. Heavens no. It bustled with the kind of energy you get when 43 camels, 17 merchants, and one confused lute player all try to check in at the same time. The air smelled of roasted chickpeas, mild regret, and someone's forgotten sandal stew. Bahram arrived with Mahmud, who had recently developed a limp that only appeared when romance was mentioned. Bahram, ever hopeful, had heard that Lianhua's caravan might be stopping here. He had prepared a speech. It was heartfelt, poetic, and just vague enough to be misinterpreted as a trade proposal. Meanwhile, Lianhua was indeed nearby, at a different caravanserai, one with better lighting and fewer philosophical goats. She had acquired a new camel named Susan, who had a dramatic flair and refused to walk unless addressed as Madam. Lianhua didn't mind. Susan had excellent taste in spices and once sneezed in perfect iambic pentameter. Back at Bahram's caravanserai, a merchant named Tariq was hosting a confession circle. It was a tradition where weary travelers shared secrets, regrets, and mildly embarrassing dreams. Bahram, encouraged by a bowl of lukewarm lentil soup and 2 raisins, stood up. "I am in love," he declared, "with a woman I've never met. Her name is Lianhua. She sells spices, possibly cinnamon, possibly dreams." The crowd murmured. One camel wept. A lute player composed a ballad on the spot titled "Cumin for the Heart." Tariq nodded solemnly. "That's beautiful. Also, we're out of chickpeas." Meanwhile, at the other caravanserai, Lianhua was listening to a merchant describe a poet named Bahram, who once cried into lentils and wrote letters to the moon. She blinked. That sounds familiar. She scribbled a note to To the poet who dreams of cinnamon, I exist. Also, I prefer nutmeg. Lianhua. She tied it to Susan's saddle. Susan sneezed dramatically and walked in the opposite direction. And so, the lovers confessed, separately, in different buildings, with different soups. But the Silk Road listened, the stars leaned in, and somewhere, a camel named Mahmud rolled his eyes and chewed on a scroll. It began with a breeze, a gentle whisper across the dunes, like a camel sighing in its sleep. Bahram, ever the romantic, took it as a sign. The wind carries my longing, he declared, dramatically tossing his latest scroll into the air. Mahmud the camel rolled his eyes so hard he nearly sprained something, but the breeze had ambitions. It grew into a gust, then a full-blown sandstorm with the emotional range of a rejected love poem. Scrolls flew, tents flapped. One merchant lost his entire inventory of melancholy raisins. Bahram's scroll, his finest yet, was swept into the chaos. It tumbled through the air like a heartbroken falafel, eventually landing in a soup pot belonging to a traveling chef named Zoya. Zoya stirred the pot, blinked at the scroll, and read aloud, Dearest Lianhua, I saw a mirage today. It looked like you, but it was actually a goat. I cried anyway. Yours in sandy devotion. Bahram. Zoya nodded. Needs salt, she said, and used the scroll to season the lentils. Meanwhile, Lianhua was sheltering in a spice tent, sipping tea and wondering why her nutmeg kept rearranging itself into the shape of a question mark. Susan the camel was meditating. A merchant burst in, covered in sand and soup, shouting, a scroll, in the lentils. It spoke of love and goats. Lianhua blinked. Was it signed Bahram? The merchant paused. It might have been. Or Babar. Or possibly yours in sandy devotion. Lianhua sighed. That sounds about right. She scribbled a reply. To the man who cries at goats, I understand. Also, lentils are better with cumin. Lianhua. She tied it to Susan's saddle. Susan sneezed, spun in a circle, and walked directly into a sand dune. Back in the storm, Bahram was composing a new poem, using grains of rice and emotional turbulence. Mahmud refused to help, citing artistic differences. And so, the sandstorm passed. The scrolls settled. The soup was served. And somewhere, in the heart of the desert, love continued to blow in the wrong direction. In the town of Mishtan, nestled between two dunes and one very indecisive river, lived a translator named Harun. Harun was known for two things: his ability to speak 7 languages and his complete inability to understand poetry. One day, a scroll arrived, dusty, dramatic, and sealed with apricot wax. Harun opened it, squinted, and read aloud, Dearest Lianhua, your name dances like cinnamon in the wind. I dream of your cumin-scented laughter. Yours in longing, Bahram. Harun frowned. Clearly a recipe, he muttered, possibly for pickled turnips. He translated the scroll into trade Cantonese, then into desert Greek, and finally into something he called emotionally neutral Persian. The final version read, To whom it may concern, add cinnamon to wind, stir in cumin, serve with longing. Bahram, possibly a chef. He handed the translation to a merchant named Zubaydah, who immediately added it to her cookbook under Spices That Make You Cry. Meanwhile, Bahram was composing his next letter, unaware that his previous one was now being served with lentils and a side of existential confusion. He wrote, Dear Lianhua, I saw a cloud shaped like your spice shelf. Mahmud sneezed. I took it as a sign. Yours in sneezy devotion, Bahram. Mahmud, for his part, was developing a cough that sounded suspiciously like sarcasm. Back in Dunhuang, Lianhua received a scroll, translated by Harun. She read, "Add cinnamon to wind, stir in cumin, serve with longing." She blinked. Is this a poem or a marinade? Susan the camel snorted, which Lianhua interpreted as both. She scribbled a reply, "To the poet chef, I prefer my longing lightly salted. Also, cumin makes me sneeze." Lianhua. She tied it to Susan's saddle. Susan sneezed, spun in a circle, and walked directly into a spice tent. Harun, meanwhile, was hired to translate a love song. He turned it into a weather report, and so the lovers continued their slow, scroll-based courtship, lost in translation, buried in spices, and drifting ever closer across the sleepy sands of the Silk Road. In the town of Kazvin, where the sand whispered secrets and the camels judged silently, lived a mapmaker named Jalil. Jalil was precise, proud, and just a little bit petty. He could chart a route through a sandstorm blindfolded, but he couldn't chart his way out of a broken heart. Years ago, Jalil had fallen for Lianhua. She had complimented his compass once, and he had immediately drafted a marriage proposal in calligraphy. She never responded, mostly because she thought the scroll was a spice invoice. Now, Jalil had heard rumors, whispers of a poet named Bahram, who wrote scrolls to Lianhua and cried into lentils. Jalil was not amused, so he did what any emotionally unstable cartographer would do. He redrew the Silk Road. He rerouted Bahram's caravan through the valley of mild inconvenience, past the dunes of existential doubt, and directly into the forest of misplaced goats. The new map was flawless. It even included a detour to a town that didn't exist, called Not Lianhuaville. Bahram, trusting the map, followed it faithfully. Mahmud the camel protested, citing vibes. Bahram ignored him. Meanwhile, Lianhua was traveling with Susan the camel, who had recently taken up interpretive sneezing. Her route was simple, direct, and entirely unaffected by Jalil's cartographic sabotage. She arrived at the rendezvous point Bahram had mentioned in his last scroll. She waited. She sipped tea. She alphabetized her emotional expectations. Bahram, however, was busy navigating a goat traffic jam. He wrote a letter. "Dearest Lianhua, I am lost. The map says I'm in Not Lianhuaville. There are goats, yours in cartographic despair, Bahram." He tied it to Mahmud's tail. Mahmud refused to move until bribed with a poem-free fig. Back in Kazvin, Jalil was pleased. "That'll teach him," he muttered, drawing a new river shaped like a broken heart. And so, the lovers missed each other again, thanks to a mapmaker with unresolved feelings and a camel with a fig addiction. But the stars above twinkled with mischief. The Silk Road was long. The nights were many. And love, like a badly drawn map, always found a way to wander back. The caravan was moving. Technically, if you squinted hard enough and measured progress in centimeters per hour, it was practically a stampede. But in reality, it was more of a philosophical journey, one that questioned the very nature of movement. Bahram had joined this particular caravan because it was rumored to carry mildly important spices, not the glamorous ones like saffron or star anise. No, this caravan specialized in the middle children of the spice world: coriander, fenugreek, and a batch of emotionally unstable turmeric. The caravan leader, Uncle Jamil, believed in slow travel. "Speed is for soup," he declared, as his camel napped mid-stride. Bahram, ever patient, took this as a sign from the universe to write yet another letter to Lianhua. Dearest Lianhua, I am surrounded by coriander. It smells like compromise. The camels are meditating. Yours in aromatic confusion, Bahram. He tied the scroll to a spice sack labeled possibly nutmeg. Mahmud the camel refused to carry it, citing artistic differences and a mild allergy to coriander. Meanwhile, Lianhua was traveling with Susan the camel, who had recently taken up interpretive sneezing and was now demanding applause after every exhale. Their caravan was swift, efficient, and powered by a merchant named Farida, who believed in punctual romance. Lianhua had received no new scrolls, just a shipment of cumin that smelled like longing, and a note from a monk asking if paprika could be used to summon inner peace. She sighed. If Bahram truly exists, he's probably stuck behind a philosophical camel. Back in the desert, Bahram's caravan paused for a 3-hour discussion on the emotional implications of fennel. One merchant cried. Another proposed to a spice crate. Bahram wrote another poem, this time shaped like a question mark. And so, the lovers continued their journey. One swift, one slow, both scented with confusion. The Silk Road stretched on. The stars blinked sleepily. And somewhere, a camel named Mahmud composed a haiku about coriander and regret. Bahram had run out of camels. Mahmud had staged a walkout after being asked to carry a scroll sealed with excessive emotional wax. The other caravan animals were either busy meditating or refusing to participate in romance-related logistics. That's when Bahram met Yusuf the yak. Yusuf was not a male yak. He was a cheese yak. His job was to transport mildly pungent dairy products across the desert. But Bahram, desperate and poetic, saw potential. Yusuf, he whispered, will you carry my heart? Yusuf blinked, then sneezed directly onto Bahram's scroll. Bahram took that as a yes. He tied his latest letter to Yusuf's saddle, nestled between 2 wheels of contemplative cheddar. The scroll read, Dearest Lianhua, I have entrusted this message to a yak. He smells like destiny. Yours in dairy-scented devotion, Bahram. Yusuf trotted off, slowly, thoughtfully, and in the wrong direction. Meanwhile, Lianhua was browsing a cheese market in the town of Tashkand. She was inspecting a wheel of emotionally complex Gouda when a yak wandered in, trailing scrolls and smelling faintly of misplaced romance. The merchant blinked. That yak is not from here. Lianhua approached. She recognized the wax seal. She read the scroll. She laughed. Loudly. Susan the camel sneezed in solidarity. She scribbled a reply. To the poet who trusts yaks, I admire your optimism. Also, the cheddar is excellent. Lianhua. She tied it to Yusuf's horn. Yusuf blinked, turned around, and walked directly into a pickle stall. Back in the desert, Bahram waited. He composed a haiku about cheese and longing. Mahmud watched from a distance, chewing on a scroll and muttering about professional boundaries. And so, the lovers continued their slow, scroll-based saga, now with dairy. The Silk Road stretched on, the stars twinkled, and somewhere, a yak named Yusuf carried love letters and lactose with equal confusion. The Tent of Tangled Translations was legendary, not for its accuracy, but for its ability to turn love letters into laundry lists and romantic poetry into tax codes. It sat at the edge of the desert like a confused punctuation mark, flapping gently in the breeze and smelling faintly of ink and misplaced passion. Bahram had arrived with high hopes and low expectations. His latest scroll, his 23rd attempt at emotional clarity, was written in 3 languages, 2 dialects, and 1 poetic sigh. He handed it to the tent's resident translator, a man named Kadir, who wore spectacles made from polished beetle shells and spoke in footnotes. Kadir read the scroll. Dearest Lianhua, your name is a spice in my soul. I dream of your cumin-scented laughter. Yours in longing, Bahram. He nodded solemnly and translated it into trade Mandarin, then into Caravanese, and finally into something he called romantic bureaucratese. The final version read, to whom it may concern, inventory request, 1 unit of cumin, emotional surcharge, applicable, signed, Bahram, Department of Longing. Bahram blinked. That's not quite what I meant. Kadir shrugged. It's what the desert understands. Meanwhile, Lianhua was browsing scrolls at a spice bazaar, looking for anything that didn't involve cumin or emotional surcharges. A merchant handed her a scroll with a wax seal shaped like a sigh. She opened it and read, Inventory request, 1 unit of cumin. She frowned. Is this a love letter or a spice invoice? Susan the camel sneezed in a way that suggested both. Lianhua scribbled a reply. To the Department of Longing. Cumin is currently out of stock. Please check back after the next sandstorm. Lianhua. She tied it to a scroll pigeon named Harold, who promptly flew in the wrong direction and landed in a soup pot. Back at the tent of Tangled Translations, Kadir was working on a new project, turning breakup letters into motivational speeches. Bahram sighed and began composing his next scroll, this time using only drawings of camels and emotionally ambiguous spices. And so, the lovers continued their slow, scroll-based saga, lost in translation, tangled in bureaucracy, and drifting ever closer across the sleepy sands of the Silk Road. In the town of Zarafshan, where the moon hung low like a sleepy lantern and the air smelled faintly of roasted almonds and unresolved emotions, there lived a rug merchant named Amin. His carpets were famous, not for their patterns, but for their opinions. Amin claimed his rugs whispered stories at night. Not loudly, of course, just enough to make you question your life choices while brushing your teeth. Bahram arrived at Amin's shop, hoping to find a rug that could guide him to Lianhua. He was desperate. He had tried camels, yaks, pigeons, and one emotionally unavailable goat. Now, he was ready to trust textiles. Amin greeted him with a bow and a yawn. Welcome, seeker of woven wisdom. Would you like a rug that whispers truths, or one that judges silently? Bahram blinked. Do you have one that knows where Lianhua is? Amin nodded and unfurled a carpet with swirls of cinnamon and regret. It hummed softly, then whispered, She dreams of you. She travels east. She prefers nutmeg. Bahram gasped. She dreams of me? The carpet coughed. Or possibly of soup. It's hard to tell. Meanwhile, Lianhua was browsing rugs in a different town. She paused at one with a pattern shaped like a camel, sneezing. The merchant leaned in and said, This one speaks of a poet named Bahram. He cries into lentils. Lianhua smiled. That sounds familiar. She purchased the rug and slept on it that night. It whispered, He searches for you. He travels west. He smells like coriander. She scribbled a note. To the poet of coriander and lentils, I hear you. Also, this rug is very judgmental. Lianhua. She tied it to Susan's saddle. Susan sneezed, spun in a circle, and walked directly into a lantern. Back in Zarafshan, Bahram lay on his whispering rug, listening to tales of missed connections and romantic detours. Mahmoud, the camel, snorted and curled up beside him, dreaming of figs and emotional boundaries. And so, the lovers continued their slow, scroll and rug-based saga, guided by whispering carpets, wandering stars, and the occasional sneeze. The Silk Road stretched on, the night deepened, and somewhere, a rug judged silently in the moonlight. The town of Khotan was known for two things: its silk and its confusing signage. Streets were labeled with poetic riddles, and directions often included phrases like, "Turn left at the sighing willow," or "Continue until your camel questions its purpose." Bahram arrived with hope in his heart, and Mahmud at his side, who had recently taken a vow of emotional neutrality. Bahram had received a whisper from a rug, a rumor from a raisin merchant, and a scroll from a pigeon named Harold, who had finally escaped the soup pot. All signs pointed to Lianhua being in Khotan. He checked into a caravanserai called the Slightly Disappointed Fig, ordered a bowl of lentils, and waited. Meanwhile, Lianhua had also arrived in Khotan. She was staying at the Melancholy Apricot, just one street over, which was actually the same street, depending on how you interpreted the signage. She had heard whispers of Bahram's arrival and was cautiously optimistic, though Susan the camel had sneezed 3 times that morning, which usually meant emotional turbulence ahead. She wrote a note. To the poet of misplaced scrolls, I am here. I am waiting. Also, the apricot jam is suspiciously philosophical. Lianhua. She handed it to a courier who promptly tripped over a philosophical goat and delivered the scroll to a man named Barham, who sold ornamental onions. Bahram, meanwhile, was composing his own note. Dearest Lianhua, I am in Khotan. I am waiting. Mahmud refuses to celebrate. Yours in cautious anticipation, Bahram. He gave it to a courier who accidentally delivered it to a woman named Linhua, who was allergic to poetry and immediately used it to wrap a mildly judgmental melon. And so, the lovers waited, separately, on the same street, in different inns, with identical jam. The stars above twinkled with dramatic irony. The Silk Road sighed, and Mahmud, ever the realist, refused to participate in any emotional festivities. Once a year, in the town of Yarkand, the locals held the Festival of Forgotten Faces, a celebration of anonymity, mystery, and mildly confusing dance routines. Everyone wore masks. No one used names, and the goal was simple: to forget who you were and remember who you might have been if your camel hadn't eaten your destiny. Bahram arrived, wearing a mask shaped like a wistful almond. Mahmud refused to participate, citing a deep mistrust of festive ambiguity. Bahram hoped, no, dreamed, that Lianhua might be there. After all, the stars had whispered, the rugs had hinted, and a yak had sneezed in her direction. Meanwhile, Lianhua had also arrived. Her mask resembled a contemplative clove. Susan the camel wore a feathered hat and insisted on being addressed as Madam Spice. Lianhua wasn't sure what she was looking for, but she knew she'd recognize it by the way it made her heart sneeze. The music began, slow, sleepy, and slightly off-key. Dancers twirled. Merchants offered snacks shaped like philosophical punctuation. Bahram wandered through the crowd, clutching a scroll he couldn't deliver. Lianhua sipped tea that tasted like déjà vu. And then they danced. Not dramatically, not passionately, just gently. Two masked strangers, drawn together by the rhythm of longing and the scent of cumin in the air. They didn't speak. They didn't ask names. They just moved, slowly, like two scrolls drifting toward the same pigeon. Bahram felt something. Lianhua felt something. Mahmoud felt nothing and chewed on a decorative lantern. The dance ended. The crowd applauded politely. The masked strangers bowed and walked away, each wondering if the other had been real or just a figment of festival-induced romance. Later that night, Bahram wrote, "Dearest Lianhua, I danced with a stranger who felt like you, or possibly a clove, yours in masked confusion." Bahram Lianhua wrote, "To the poet of almond-shaped mystery, I danced with someone who didn't ask my name. It felt like a scroll." Lianhua, neither scroll was delivered. One was eaten by a goat. The other was used to wrap a mildly judgmental apricot. And so, the lovers almost met, almost spoke, almost knew. But the Silk Road is long. The nights are many. And love, like a festival mask, sometimes hides in plain sight. It had been 6 years since Bahram first wrote the scroll, sealed with apricot wax, scented with longing, and tied to a camel who promptly sat on it. The scroll had traveled far, through sandstorms, soup pots, bureaucratic outposts, and one particularly judgmental cheese market. And now, finally, it arrived. Lianhua was sipping tea in a quiet corner of Dunhuang, alphabetizing her emotional expectations when a courier stumbled in, covered in dust and existential dread. He handed her the scroll, coughed once, and collapsed into a decorative spice barrel. She opened it slowly. The wax was cracked. The ink had faded. But the words were unmistakably Bahram. "Dearest Lianhua, I saw a mirage shaped like your spice shelf. I cried into my lentils. Mahmoud judged me. Yours in sandy devotion." Bahram Lianhua blinked. She read it again. She laughed, loudly. Susan the camel sneezed in approval. She whispered, "He exists." She scribbled a reply. "To the poet of lentils and longing, I received your scroll. It smells like regret and cumin. I'm still here. Lianhua." She tied it to a pigeon named Gregory, who had a reputation for punctuality and a mild addiction to raisins. Meanwhile, Bahram was in a caravanserai called the Slightly Melancholy Turnip, composing a new poem about emotional turbulence and coriander. Mahmoud was chewing on a rug and refusing to comment. Gregory arrived. Bahram opened the scroll. He read. He gasped. He cried into his lentils. Again. This time, Mahmoud offered a sympathetic snort. Bahram whispered, "She exists." And so, after years of missed connections, misdelivered scrolls, and camel-related delays, the lovers had finally exchanged words. Real ones. Timely ones. Almost romantic ones. The Silk Road sighed in relief. The stars twinkled with approval. And somewhere, a pigeon named Gregory demanded raisins and respect. After years of emotional scrolls, poetic detours, and being blamed for every missed rendezvous, he announced, without fanfare, that he was retiring, effective immediately. No farewell tour, no final caravan, just a firm sit-down in the middle of a rug bazaar and a refusal to move. Bahram was devastated. "But Mahmoud, we've been through so much together." Mahmoud blinked slowly, then sneezed directly onto Bahram's latest poem. The message was clear. "I'm done." Word spread quickly. Merchants gathered. Spice traders brought gifts. A lute player composed a farewell ballad titled "Ode to a Camel Who Carried Too Much Emotional Baggage." Even Susan the camel arrived, wearing a feather boa and carrying a scroll that read, "Respect the hump." The party was modest. There were figs. There were raisins. There was a decorative banner that said, "Retirement because romance is heavy." Bahram gave a speech. "Mahmud has been more than a camel. He's been a companion, a critic, and a reluctant witness to my poetic despair. He once refused to deliver a scroll because it was too clingy. That's integrity." Mahmud snorted in agreement and accepted a ceremonial blanket embroidered with the words, "Emotionally unavailable since 728 CE. Meanwhile, Lianhua heard of the retirement through a spice courier named Bashir, who delivered gossip along with turmeric. She smiled and wrote, "To Mahmud, you carried longing with grace. You judged poetry with wisdom. Enjoy your figs." Lianhua, she tied it to Susan's saddle. Susan sneezed, spun in a circle, and walked directly into a decorative lantern. Back at the party, Bahram sat beside Mahmud, sipping lukewarm tea and reflecting on the journey. "Do you think she'll ever find me?" he asked. Mahmud blinked, then slowly turned his head toward the horizon. It was the closest thing to encouragement he'd ever offered. And so, the camel retired. The poet sighed. The silk road stretched on. The stars twinkled with nostalgia. And somewhere, a scroll fluttered in the wind, whispering of love, lentils, and one very tired camel. The bazaar in Maracanda was a swirl of colors, spices, and emotional ambiguity. Merchants shouted prices with dramatic flair. Camels strutted like they owned the place. And somewhere between the cinnamon stall and the philosophical figs, Bahram wandered with a scroll in his hand and hope in his heart. He had heard rumors, again, that Lianhua had passed through, that she had left something behind, that it wasn't a scroll, but a pouch, a spice pouch, small, unassuming, and tucked between jars of coriander and regret. Bahram found it. It was embroidered with a single word, almost. Inside was a note. "To the poet of missed moments, I was here. I waited. I left this pouch because I couldn't leave a scroll." Lianhua. Bahram held the pouch like it was made of moonlight. Mahmud, now retired and lounging nearby with a fig in his mouth, snorted softly. His version of emotional support. Bahram didn't cry. He didn't sigh. He just sat down beside a barrel of melancholy turmeric and wrote, "Dearest Lianhua, I found your pouch. It smells like nutmeg and nostalgia. I was here too. Yours in bittersweet timing. Bahram, he didn't send it. He tucked it into the pouch and left it with a merchant named Tariq, who promised to guard it like it was a scroll made of secrets. Meanwhile, Lianhua was in a different town, sipping tea that tasted like closure, and watching Susan the camel sneeze rhythmically. She felt something shift. Not dramatically, just gently, like a scroll settling into sand. She whispered, "He found it," and so the lovers continued their slow, scrollless saga, connected by pouches, whispers, and the kind of timing that only the Silk Road could understand. The stars blinked knowingly, the spices sighed, and somewhere a retired camel dreamed of figs and the poetry he never delivered. The Silk Road had seen many things: empires rise, spices spill, camels sneeze, but it had never seen a love story quite like Bahram and Lianhua's, a romance stitched together by scrolls, spices, and the kind of timing that only a philosophical goat could understand. They never met, not properly, not face to face, but they danced once, masked and moonlit. They exchanged scrolls, some delivered, some eaten. They shared dreams, misheard rumors, and one emotionally complex cheese wheel. Bahram eventually settled in a quiet town called Whispering Dunes, where he taught poetry to pigeons and wrote scrolls that no one read but everyone felt. Mahmud, retired and content, spent his days judging local camels and occasionally sighing at sunsets. Lianhua opened a spice shop called Bittersweet and Bold, where she sold nutmeg with the emotional backstories and cumin that made people cry. Susan the camel became a local celebrity, known for her dramatic sneezes and impeccable taste in rugs. They never married, they never kissed, but their story traveled farther than any caravan. It was told in scrolls, whispered in bazaars, embroidered into rugs, and hummed by camels who didn't believe in romance, but respected good storytelling. And every now and then, a traveler would ask, "Did Bahram and Lianhua ever meet?" And someone would smile and say, "Almost. So now, dear dreamer, the scroll is sealed, the spices are sorted, the camels are tucked in. You've wandered the Silk Road with two lovers who never quite found each other, but somehow found us. Let their story drift into your dreams, like a pigeon carrying a scroll across a sleepy sky. Good night. May your lentils be warm, your camels cooperative, and your love letters always arrive, eventually."